Erich Fromm, another guy born in Germany, got his PhD from the University of Heidelberg in 1922. He studies psychoanalysis at the Institute of Berlin, which was the one of the predominant places. Of course, obviously Freud was in Vienna. And as I mentioned before, he becomes a lay analyst. So he's a guy with a PhD becoming an analyst. He comes to the United States in 1933 again, gets out before the Nazis really start getting into the nasty stuff. Comes to the United States, ends up in New York, and he works very closely with Karen Horney. And this sometimes happens with people who work closely together. They, as you would all say, hook up, and that apparently does not go very well. And they have a very bitter breakup, which I don't know what, I was doing a little research, I was trying to find what that was about, and apparently there's not much written about it. I'm sure if you dig enough and you Google, you can find something about their relationship. Doesn't work out. He continues to work as an analyst and begins to write stuff. And he writes quite a few books. Again, his books, a lot like Horney's books, Fromm's books are in a way directed at the general public, and they're very readable, and they're very much attuned in dealing with issues of the time. Okay, and of course, they're here in the United States during World War II, and they experienced that kind of stuff, and then post-World War, the Cold War and these kind of things. And Fromm actually talks a lot about these kinds of subjects. Very interesting. He's one of the few psychoanalysts. There's another really good book that's very psychoanalytic, written by a psychoanalyst about Hitler. But Fromm is actually one of the few psychoanalysts to really start writing, or one of the early ones to write about Hitler. Talks a little about Hitler. It's very interesting. And the Nazis and what motivates Nazism and things like that. So Fromm starts out with his ideas, this idea about basic human conditions and needs, and he talks about freedom. And he says freedom is a condition that poses a psychological problem. Yes?
They had a relationship, but she was much older.
I think she was a bit older than him, yeah. I don't think that much older, but maybe
15 years.
10, 15 years.
So that's like what she wrote about in the article.
Back in the day, it was the man was very old. And
Yeah, that was probably, well, May, December romances are still, now it's a little bit more common. But yeah, that may have created problems. We don't really know what was going on. If you look it up, I'm sure it's somewhere somebody's written about it. But yeah, she was older than him, yes. So he writes about freedom as a human condition that creates a psychological problem for us. Okay? We want to be free, we want to be autonomous. We don't want people telling us what to do. At the same time, the more free we become, the more we become alienated and separate from other people. And so this creates a kind of a conundrum for us. Okay? Again, I will say that I think maybe Fromm was reading a little of existentialism, because this existentialists talk a lot about this kind of thing. And especially existentialist writers, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, who I think we will mention later, though I'm not sure it's in your book, talk about this kind of psychological problem, almost in the same way. This is a big problem for existentialists, is freedom. Okay? That we're free to create our own meaning in life, and yet, by doing this, we can become alienated, etc., etc., etc. So for Fromm, this is the central problem. And for Fromm also, this leads to one of the things that we feel that we realize when we think about this stuff, is we realize that we are mortal beings, that we are going to die someday. And this awareness of death creates for Fromm, essentially creates a form of anxiety. And that really the motivating factor for us as human beings is this sort of fear of death, okay, this awareness of death. Okay? And this is another thing that freedom brings us, that we're actually cognizant of our own mortality. Okay? And this creates problems. So what we want to do when we have these realizations is that we want to do something you guys are probably all familiar with. I certainly am. We want to escape the burdens of this realization. We want to escape the burden of freedom. So, for Fromm, there are 3 mechanisms for doing this. And again, if this sounds a little like Karen Horney's ideas, maybe they were, sharing ideas when they were hanging out together. We don't know. The first one, authoritarianism. Second one is destructiveness. And the third is automation conformity. And so these are very much like Horney's ideas, right? Authoritarianism is like, that sort of hostile moving against. Authoritarianism, is more like the moving towards, the compliance, or it can also be putting people under your control or controlling them. Either way, being controlled or putting people under your control. Destructiveness is going to be like moving against, and automation conformity is a little bit, not exactly like moving away, but it's more like just going along with the crowd. It's a little different. Okay. And we can see, and so Fromm also had this idea, he also had a little bit more of a positive psychology view. He also thought this idea of that we had a basic drive toward the affirmation of life. And later on he calls this, I believe the word is off the top of my head, biophilious orientation, as opposed to a necrophilious orientation. I think we'll talk about that later. But this idea that we have this drive toward affirming our lives, okay? And in order to do this, we have to have basic needs to do this. And so here are the basic things that we need. Relatedness, relating to other people, loving productively, transcendence, rising above the animal level of creatureliness, I love this word, and becoming active creators. Rootedness, feeling that we belong, a sense of identity, being aware of ourselves as separate and unique individuals. Frame of orientation and object of devotion, having a stable and consistent frame of reference to organize perceptions and make sense of our environment. Freudians would call this ego strength. Excitation, stimulation, actually actively striving for a goal rather than simply responding. Now, again, from these things, again, think of these as like defense mechanisms, these escape mechanisms. Again, from these ideas, what he gets are 5 character orientations that are common in Western society. So he was not extrapolating his character orientations to everybody in the entire world. He was saying, these are the ones that I'm seeing in Western society. Okay. Receptive personalities believe the only way they can obtain something that they want is to receive it from an outside source, and they react passively, waiting to be loved. Exploitive personalities take the things they want by force or cunning and exploit others for their own ends. Hoarding personalities save what they already have, surround themselves with a wall, are miserly in their relationship to others. Marketing personalities experience themselves as commodity in the market, which may be described as opportunistic chameleons, changing their colors and values as they perceive the forces of the market to change. So you can see these kind of updated a little bit Freud's stuff and to some degree Horney's stuff to sort of fit in the Western world, right? You can tell this is a guy who moved to New York, right? Talk about marketing, These 4 are basically considered to be bad, and the last one, productive, is considered to be the good one. Okay, productive personalities value themselves and others for who they are, how they relate to the world by accurately perceiving it and enriching it through their own creative powers. So this is the idea. You want to be productive. These other ones have some issues with it. Okay? Issues with it. Now again, we live near LA. is very interesting. And so this marketing one is very, very common where we live, right? You know, which actors and people in the TV industry, they have to modify themselves, market themselves, change their colors and values as they perceive the forces of the market. You know, you go in for an audition, and the producer doesn't like your mustache, it comes off, right? You know, I've done some TV work. I did a pilot shooting once, and they told me to wear a certain kind of clothes. The producer told me to wear a certain kind of clothes. I went down, and I got a call from the executive producer the next day, and they said, I want you to change your clothes. I want you to wear these kind of clothes. I want you to cut your hair. I want you to do this, that. You need to change because the network executives didn't like how you looked on the film. Right? They didn't like how you looked. You go back and change all these things. And so you're a commodity in the market. You want to be in that business. You're expected to do what they tell you. If you don't work. Typical LA kind of thing, right? And you can go experience this. I've had a little tiny experience of it, but I mean, this is, very, very typical. It's in marketing. It reinforces this sort of marketing kind of a thing. If you don't do this, you don't work in LA. Okay? Unless you're already famous or whatever. If you have a YouTube channel with 1 million hits, then maybe you can dictate a little bit what you want, but typically not. Okay? So we want to be productive. So Fromm was very interested in authoritarianism, equal authoritarians, and this is why he wrote about Hitler. And he talked about authoritarian ethics and the idea that you have a conscience that's rooted outside the individual. And he talked about that in contrast with humanistic ethics, which represent a true virtue in the sense of the unfolding of a person's power related to your own human nature. It's kind of interesting. And he talked about these two things, the biophilious character, orientation to seek life, and a necrophilious character, which is attracted to what is dead and decaying and seeks to destroy life. And Fromm thought that Hitler and a lot of the other Nazis, had this necrophilious character, that they had this love of death. Okay? And this is true. If you study Nazis, this is really true. There was a lot of death. The SS had death heads, caps, caps with a skull on them, and everything. There was images of death everywhere. And of course, they actually literally caused death and destruction of all sorts of people. Okay? And this necrophilious character basically has a root. For Fromm, has a root. This sort of, he calls it malignant aggression, has a root in a childhood where there's bad socioeconomic conditions, where the person as a child does not get their needs fulfilled. And this leads them to want to do this, and then they grow up and they can be really resentful and they can want to just destroy everything. Well, I can't have it, you can't have it either, so I'm just going to destroy everything. As opposed to the biophilious character, which is somebody who loves life, right, and wants to encourage, sort of life energy, life affirmation. So those are very important. And he has these modes as well. He talks about the having mode, which relies on possessions that a person has. And he says this is also a source for the lust for power and leads to isolation and fear. And the being mode, which depends solely on basically existing and doing that productive love, being in this one, being productive. And this leads supposedly to solidarity and joy. And so Fromm has a little bit of he was very, in young life, I believe he was very interested in Marx. And so there is a socialist tint to his works. Okay? Biophilious character wants sort of, the tide to float all boats, that everybody, sort of shares together, and that you break down barriers between people, and these ideas that, you can maybe see a little bit of these coming out of socialism. Okay? So there definitely is a little socialist bent to this guy. Okay. Assessment and research. Assessment and research are focused on culture and society and their influence on character. Again, Fromm, as a clinician, he does not do, hypothesis-based studies of measuring things. He's getting a lot of his conclusions from, his cases, interacting with people. Also, in being sort of, in a way, a psychoanalytic social psychologist, seeing how these things that he sees in the clinic play out in the larger stage of the world, in the larger stage of interacting with cultures and people in the world. So again, not scientific in the strict sense. However, Fromm's ideas inspire a bunch of scientific studies. And one of the most interesting one of these Mexican village studies. He went down to Mexico, these kind of hard scrabble villages, and they studied people. And the book talks about this. The Mexican village studies, they find that, as the technology comes into the village, modern technology, that the villagers lose their traditional values and lifestyles, and they don't do these sort of self-created festivals and things like that, but instead they start watching TVs and movies, and they, of course, taking on the values from those TVs and movies. And they gave these villagers in-depth questionnaires, and they scored them for characterological motivation factors. They gave them the Rorschach test, looked for repressed feelings, and they showed that there were three main classes in the village that looked like three of the social character types: landowners that were productive, hoarding; the poor workers who were unproductive, receptive; in the business group, the productive, exploitive people. Okay? And so again, this seemed to confirm some of Fromm's theories about these sort of characters, okay, that he talked about. And that the idea that character is affected by social structure, not necessarily just by unconscious forces, but it's also by the social structure. Other studies done on self-orientation of corporate leaders. And again, this self-orientation comes about as a potentially new character type, which is related to narcissism. And they found this in the study, so again, give some support to this. And they also talked about another study where they talked about the pathogenic effects of globalization. So again, this is a Frommian kind of thing that, as you globalize the world, if things become homogenized, you get all sorts of new kind of characters. And he talked about this ego-oriented character, which is a typical doer who's compelled to construct reality, a new reality, without having any limits or boundaries. I don't know if that's good or bad. So a bunch of studies here that get inspired by Fromm. The other one that gets studied that inspires him is this thing called terror management theory. Okay? Terror management theory. This is a new thing. This comes from looking at Fromm, influenced by Fromm's ideas about authoritarianism, and again, by authoritarianism also this would include the sort of necrophilius character. And terror management theory is very interesting. Our professor here, Dr. Sonke, Melissa Sonke, she is an expert in this. This is her area of research. So this is really quite a fascinating area, very interesting. And this is something that came out in academic circles, was developed in academic circles after 9/11. And academics started wondering, why would people do these terrorist acts? Why would they do these horrible things? And what are the emotions and behaviors that are motivated or behind terrorist act like crashing a plane into the World Trade Center? Horrible thing. And they looked at insights from Fromm. They looked at Fromm's work. They also looked at insights from existential psychology and evolutionary theory. And they built up a framework of things that they could actually test and they could measure. So this is actually an active academic area right now. And they seek to explain why people react the way they do to the threat of death and how this reaction influences their cognitions and emotions. It suggests that an inborn annihilation anxiety, and again this is what Fromm was talking about, together with human awareness of the inevitability of death, and that comes from existentialism, creates an ever-present possibility of terror. This fear induces us to construct a belief system to maintain the nature of reality and assure ourselves of immortality through shared links to institutions, traditions, and symbols. When we live up to the standards of our faith, politics, and social norms, we manage the terror and we feel safe. However, when our worldviews, these cultural constructs requiring consensus for continuation, are threatened by alternative belief systems, then we have problems. Okay, we get reminded of the fallibility of our constructs, that we no longer can sort of distract ourselves from this fear of death by pretending to feel safe, and then we start having issues. Okay? And this annihilation anxiety then comes back as racial and religious prejudice, and can also come back as terrorism. Okay? Can also come back as terrorism, that we get a little paranoid, we think we have to destroy those others because they are preventing us from glossing over this fear of death, if you want to put it in blunt terms. So this is very, very interesting. And they talk about terrorism as essentially response from people in a position of weakness. Hostility and violence come to the fore when basic human needs are not met within a basic ideology and resources of society. And so it's not any surprise, or not be any surprise to the terror management people, that if you look at people who are doing, suicide bombings and things like that, they come from a position, a place where they are deprived of basic human needs. Okay? Now, that deprivation could be because of conditions imposed upon them from the outside, and you could make an argument maybe about the Palestinians, that the conditions imposed on them, especially when their land was taken away from them by, during the creation of Israel, that condition imposed on them leads them to become terrorists. Okay? Now, the terrorism is not effective, and you can see that also in Palestine. Their being terrorists has not been very effective for them. It's a terrible strategy for them, and yet they continue to do it, right? An is a form of craziness, in my opinion. Okay? Now, you could also say that the Israelis have a kind of an over hostile response to the Palestinians, but that is also because Israelis now feel threatened. They don't feel safe anymore, right? And so when you have a bunch of Palestinians protesting at the border, the Israelis feel like it's justified to shoot them because they feel not safe, because they are thinking that somebody could come in and blow up a bunch of people, innocent people, and that's happened. And so their sense of safety, their sense that their society, their culture is keeping them from death is shaken. And so then their response is to do something terroristic back to the Palestinians, who have caused them to feel not safe anymore. And so again, you can see this Palestinians-Israeli situation. You've got problems on both sides. And again, I'm not picking sides here being political, but you can see there's problems on both sides. The Palestinian strategy of suicide bombing, whatever you might have, is really not working very well. But they have that because their basic needs as human beings are not being met. And likewise, pretty much the same kind of thing for the Israelis. Basic needs are different, right? Different basic needs, but they're still not being met. And so you see these kind of international situations that become really quite intractable. Okay? And so that's a good example. I think it's a good example of this kind of stuff. And you can think of other examples of this. So the terror management people seek to study this. This is what their thing is. It's a very interesting area of research. And if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to talk to Dr. Sunke and see what, I think she has a research group that's doing stuff that she's working with, and you might have an opportunity to do some research on this stuff with her. She really knows a lot about this stuff. Yes?
Doesn't this just then create a cycle of terror then?
Yeah, but that's part of the problem. So the research is, how do you break that cycle of terror? So you got Palestinians and Israelis. How do you break the cycle of terror? Well, it would suggest you try to figure out, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, you try to figure out ways that people can get their basic needs met, basic human needs. So first of all, you can use Fromm or some other theorist to say, what are the basic needs that people have? Okay? What are the basic needs that people have? And you can try to analyze that and figure out what it is, and then is there a way that those can be provided? And if we provide those, does the terrorism actually start reducing down? Okay? Yes?
So I was wondering if this kind of extreme pathway that they're going through, instead of being a little bit more civil about it, could have started from childhood, from the authoritarian parent, it's more common to hit your children versus in America,
That there may be less of a barrier to the hostile behavior. Yeah, it's possible. But you could also say it, you could also explain it this way, that if the person was subject to authoritarian parenting and violence, being beat by their parents, then you could say some of their basic needs are not been met. You know, and that's another way that you could say it. So I mean, yes, it could be something, you know, from the culture that does this, from the place that does it, or it could be something imposed upon them. It could be either thing, right? It could be either thing. Not that you can't really. And so some situations, I think it's, you know, you can more easily identify, you know, where that's coming from. Okay? Yeah.
Well, as you said, parents who are more fundamental in their parenting style, or they let more fundamental religious beliefs influence their parenting styles, they do tend to be more authoritarian.
Yeah. Well, you know, so you can say, I mean, so people talk about this, and again, I'm not taking sides or trying to be political here, but, you know, people have made the correlation, if you will, between the rise of the religious fundamentalism here in America and the rise of authoritarianism in our government. You know, correlational. I don't know if it's causal or not, but you could make a case for that. And from this terror management theory or from Fromm's theory, you could make a case from that. And that it leads us to be more of as a country, to have more of a necrophilious character, where we go out, we get involved in wars, and we feel like that we need to go out and destroy people in order to feel safe. And again, you know, this is the one thing, you know, we're, you know, again, not putting down the Army. You know, I've got relatives who are, you know, in the Army or in the military, but the idea that, you know, that we need to have the strong military to go out in the world, and in order for us to be safe from annihilation, right? That's an American thought. Not all countries have this thought. Denmark doesn't have a big military. Okay, Denmark doesn't have a big. They don't have the same need, you know, to spend money on the military and to go out and have our military forces, you know, intervene in other countries and other places in the world. They don't have that need. We have that need in America. And from a Fromm point of view, or from a point of view of terror management, that's because this makes us to feel safe from our own deaths, our own, you know, our own awareness of our own mortality. Okay? Is that good or bad? I'm not saying. But I'm just saying we're different. Other countries don't have that. You know, Finland doesn't have that. You know, Sweden doesn't have that, as far as I know. Ecuador doesn't really have that. They're not going out and putting soldiers all around the world. You know, they don't have that same thing. They have other things. All these countries have other things, but they don't have the one that we have, right? So we have this need. And again, for the terror management people, this is because this helps us feel safe. Now, another thing that's going on with terror management stuff is that there's been a bunch of neurobiological research. They're looking at parts of the brain that are responsible for anxiety and fear, and parts that play a role when we have bias against other people. And they're seeing things like the bias plays a role, the amygdala plays a role in bias. And they're looking and finding neurobiological correlates of this stuff. So my guess is with this research, as in almost everything in psychology, that there's more emphasis now on neurobiology stuff than, you know, because we're looking to see where does this happen in the brain, you know. And they've also found evidence that the cortex will shut off in certain situations. You know, again, you don't want the thinking, rational mind going. You just want to behave, you know, respond sort of emotionally in these situations. And again, when you see groups, and this is something that Freud said, by the way, that when people are in groups, that, you know, they become really much more stupid. They don't act rationally in group. They act from an emotional place. And Freud said it, and a guy named Laban said this before Freud. Freud got it from him. But this is a great insight that still seems to be true. And again, you know, when you see groups of people doing things, you know, people are not the brightest bulbs when they're in a group. And again, all you got to do is go on TV and flip on a political rally. And again, I'm not picking sides. You can pick your own side. Doesn't matter. Flip on a political rally, and you can see the emotionalism is really guiding people. There's not a lot of thought, not a lot of rational thought going on in a political rally. Maybe by the leader who is rationally manipulating people, which I think does happen a lot. Again, not picking sides, but you can see that. Or you can go to a sporting event or a rock concert, and you'll see that people are, in these big groups, they respond emotionally, they don't respond rationally. Right? Okay? And again, these terror management people now are even looking at some of the neurobiology of that stuff. So this is something, in my opinion, I think is important. And I'll just, as a side, I think it's important to teach you guys about this stuff because I believe in a form of psychological inoculation, if you will. It's like a vaccine. That if you know that people in groups act stupidly, the next time you're in a group and people start acting stupidly, you might be able to say, wait a minute, I know that I'm in a group, people are starting to act stupid. I'm going to start acting stupidly because I'm in this group, this is what people do, and maybe it's time to either change the group or remove myself from the group so I don't do some idiotic thing, right? Some destructive thing even. I don't know. I have this idea that some education can be an inoculation against bad behavior. I hope it's true. We do find that people who go to college are far less likely to become criminals. So we do know that's a good thing. The sad thing is our state government only puts about $4,000 a year toward your education, as where a prisoner costs between $80,000 and $100,000 a year to support. So that's more than 10-fold difference, 20-fold difference, closer to 20-fold difference. You know, so if you think you want to prevent crime, you would put $100,000 toward each student going to college, and you would have to put a lot less into housing and feeding and taking care of prisoners. But unfortunately, we already have prisons that are overfull, and so it's a really tough nut to crack. But putting money into education, educating people, is a good way to reduce crime in society, I think, because of social psychological inoculation. You know better, and you know that people do stupid things in groups, and so you don't do it. Thought, anyway. This may support that idea. So very interesting. So talk to Melissa about this. Those of you guys taking a class with her, she knows a lot about this. She's been teaching me a little bit about it, and I was really happy to see it in the book that they mentioned. I think it's a really interesting thing that's coming about, and combines a bunch of areas of thought that are represented in personality theory in this book, including this chapter. Okay, what else do we have here? Turn back on. Okay, and again, thinking critically. These are thoughts we could have here. We're going to go back to that. So these are some things to think about. So terrorism, is Fromm helpful in clarifying our response to terrorism? The stuff that we're talking about, these kind of things. Is this helpful? Escape from the burden of freedom by submitting to a new form of submission or domination. This is what a lot of people do. And this leads to authoritarian leaders. Things aren't going well for me, but if the big, great leader comes and tells me everything's going to be okay, and he's going to take care of everything, and that will be great again, you can substitute some other kind of leader, doesn't matter, left or right, I'll circle around and end up being the same once I become a dictator, Stalin was a terrible dictator. He was a leftist. Hitler was terrible. He was a rightist. You take your choice, right? So again, you can escape from this burden. I have too many choices. I'm too free. So I'm just going to give everything over. Let the leader make all the decisions for me. Okay? Escape from the burden of freedom by reacting with destruction, elimination of those perceived responsible for the threat. Well, all these people coming into our country. And they're coming from all these places, all these Muslim people, and they're terrorists, and we need to just get rid of them. First of all, we need to not let them into the country, build walls, and we need to go over there where they're from, and we need to just annihilate all of them, right? This is kind of what I'm simplifying things quite a bit, but this is kind of the attitude of Americans now, right? This is immigrants of all stripes are considered to be bad by a large section of the population. Okay. Luckily, that's hopefully not the case in California, since we have a lot of people who come from other places here. Okay. A lot of people from Latin America, a lot of people from other places. And probably, I'm guessing, most of you and a lot of our students here very easily can trace their lineage back, if not one generation, a couple generations back to grandparents or great-grandparents who immigrated here to this country, right? My dad was an immigrant to this country, right? But very common. So these are all things I think is worth thinking about. You know, again, whatever your conclusions, you may like immigrants, you may not like immigrants, but I mean, I think it's worth for you guys to think this through on your own, okay? Not just listen to the news or, you know, whatever your parents are telling you or whatever, but you to think it through on your own and to come to your own conclusions about things. Okay? Yes?
This idea of like escaping from the burden of freedom, is that like, could that be related to like a cult mentality, kind of like the Ku Klux Klan had?
Yeah. Yes. You can get together with other people who think like you reinforce each other's ideas, and then what you can do is, and then again, it's this thing too, like, oh, you know, there's a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, he says to go out and hang black people, so we're going to just go out and do it, we're just going to follow what he says, because if we thought for ourselves, it would be overwhelming, and we become overwhelmed with anxiety. So we just follow whatever the leader says. And again, you see this in Nazi Germany, right, with, you know, large sections of the population of Germany going along with, you know, shipping Jews off to concentration camps and death camps. You know, a lot of people knew about, you know, people getting put on the trains with, you know, I mean, you know, there were literally, for every Jew that was shipped to Auschwitz, you know, somebody bought a train ticket for them, right? And somebody had to process that ticket. Somebody knew there's no return ticket here, you know. People knew about this, but they just, you know, we just better go along, you know, because we don't want to think about it, right? And again, when we talk about existentialism, we'll talk a lot more about this. Because again, this is really part and parcel of the existentialist, what the existentialists talk about. And again, these guys are pulling this from, not just from Fromm, but also from existentialism. Okay? You know, it's much easier to go with the convenient lies than the difficult to realize truths, right? Because that makes you think about your own death and then you don't want to deal with it. That's what they're saying. That makes sense? Yeah. So again, I encourage you to think about these things, apply it to the world around us, you know, what we were going through, and apply it to your situation. You know, how do you feel about, you know, these kind of things? How do you feel if your ethnic heritage is being made a scapegoat for something? You know, is your ethnic people in your ethnic heritage, are they the ones responsible for, you know, for acts of terrorism? You know, how does this make you feel? What's your response to it? How do you deal with these kind of things? So I think it's very important to think about. Okay, Fromm obviously, and they said in the book here, they actually say he rejected, you know, specifically rejected scientism, which what they mean here is this narrow conception of, I think, hypothetico-deductive science, because again, this is not the only type of science. You can have this sort of observational science. Okay? And again, you know, he's coming from getting his ideas from his clinical practice and then applying these ideas in sort of a philosophical way.